And it's a very powerful way to write a story. But there's another alternative, and that is the negative narrative arc. And that is, you start a story with a problem or a question, and then instead of climbing up a mountain, there's a descent.
Mm.
And the descent goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper until you just can't even figure out how your main characters are going to get out of this mess. And it's in that deep place that you discover things like courage and sometimes wonder and love, even compassion. And out of that courage and compassion, the story begins to build up toward a different kind of resolution. So my favorite kind of stories are those. And that's, when I talk about that, I tell people that's the arc, say, for example, of the Harry Potter stories.
Mm.
You know, the initial question is, why is this boy living under the stairs? And what happens then for 7 books is you get this literal descent into darkness. It's not that great things don't happen to him along the way. He makes new friends. There are victories, but really each book goes down further and further and further and further until you're in such a depth of despair that the protagonist even dies.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's in the death that becomes the resolution for the whole community. And so then the story comes up and you have salvation. And so sometimes when I work with older audiences, they kind of don't understand that because they haven't grown up with that kind of dystopian literature.
Mm-hmm.
And they want happy stories. And so I have to point out to them that the Harry Potter books more closely follow the arc of Holy Week than some of the happy stories that they might have read as children. And that those narrative arcs are deeply embedded in the biblical account. And most of the truly powerful stories that we have about salvation and healing are not stories that are like hiking a mountain and then coming down. But the best stories in the Bible are the ones that are like falling off a cliff and then coming up. So it's really, if you're thinking about vocation and you're thinking about your spiritual journey, you know, there are spiritual journeys that go up mountains. We talk about that all the time, mountaintop experience and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of worship that's kind of like happy, clappy kind of worship that's supposed to kind of recreate those mountaintop experiences. But then there's the opposite as well. And the opposite is really a deep embodiment of the experience of Jesus in our own lives. And I have learned that for every Good Friday, there usually almost always is a resurrection. Sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. And, you know, we did a series on the Gospel of Mark here, leading up from January until Easter, with a chapter a week. And the interesting thing to notice was the disciples, Jesus would give them this sort of, here's the arc of the story, going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be executed and raised. And then the disciples immediately go, okay, yeah, but which one of us is better?
Right. They don't want to hear that.
They don't want to hear that. And growing up evangelical, we did not know what to do with that part of life.
Right.
There was no space for pain. I have a friend who is a music guy in Seattle at Eastlake. Do you know Eastlake, Brian Meeks?
Yes, I am familiar with it. I've heard it. Actually, it's a good congregation.
Yeah, they're fantastic people. My friend David, during a dark time in their period as a church, he wrote a song called "Dark, Dark Things."
Oh.
And I think some people abandoned ship over that song. It's like, that's not what we sing about at church. We don't sing about dark, dark things. But when that's what there is, it's almost disingenuous not to name it.
Yeah. And that, for me, when I was in the evangelical culture, very, sort of deeply the evangelical subculture, and I really was. I went to one of the premier evangelical colleges, and then I have my master's degree from an evangelical seminary. And my PhD work focused on the history of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. Even though I went to Duke, I studied with George Marsden. So, I mean, I really, truly know this tradition inside and out from both a participant and then also as a historian of it. And one of the things that I found deeply disturbing, and I think this was, as a woman and as a person whose life was never perfect in certain ways, which is stuff I write about in the book, this new book, actually, is that I couldn't understand the valorization of constant happiness. And I wanted to understand joy, because I thought that joy and happiness were not quite the same thing. But the subtlety of the difference between those two words escapes, I think, most of it certainly escaped most of the evangelical communities I was in. So you had to constantly have this, smile.
Yeah.
I just did that with my fingers and holding my face up. You had to have this smile, that said everything was good and the Holy Spirit was with you. And and if you didn't have that smile, it was an indication that, Satan was, pressing in on your life in some way, shape, or form. And I found that really disturbing. I used to ask my friends, well, how do you deal with something like the Holocaust? I can remember reading about, Holocaust theology when I was in college, and the bleakness of it was so extraordinary. And yet Jews were able to, they could have a conversation about it, and Catholics have the dark night of the soul, and even the gentle Methodism of my childhood. Liberal Protestantism has ways of talking about injustice and oppression, but evangelicalism did not.
Yeah.
And I just that for me was a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Because my own life had known too much pain. And as a woman, even a white woman, there's always a certain sense of marginalization that you experience in sexism. And that always puts you a little bit on the edge of any kind of sort of full authority or power in politics or in communities. And so you always feel a bit like an outsider. And if you don't have a theology of suffering or a theology of evil, a theology of injustice to help explain that, it becomes so phony very fast.
Here's the thing. The people I know who are very sure about the afterlife, people who believe it's sort of the traditional conservative package, have an unbelievably difficult time processing death when somebody they love dies. They're sure about what's happened, but it's not even, it's just an overwhelming. And yet the people I know, who don't have that, they're unsure about the afterlife or what it is or what it means. They seem to be able to move through those experiences differently. And I've often wondered why that is. And I think it's just because they've been given permission to grieve. Because as a person who knows all the answers, in some ways you hold it in for so long, and it just has to come bursting out because you're probably not ultimately sure, right? But you have to pretend to be sure.
Yes. And when I was little, one of my very favorite types of books to read were mystery novels. First of all, I loved, Nancy Drew, and then I loved Agatha Christie, and then I loved Dorothy Sayers. And my mom she belonged to the Reader's Digest condensed books of the month. And I mean, this is like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm talking to another, 19th century stuff. But it really was the mid 20th century. And so every month we would get at our house a brand new, sort of condensed volume of books. And there was almost always a mystery story in that volume. And I would just grab that and I would read those books, sometimes even before my mom would get them. And that concept of mystery, that's what you're talking about, is that evangelicalism does not have a place for mystery. They think of mystery as ambiguity, which I actually think is actually a good word, but I understand why evangelicals don't. The emphasis in evangelicalism theologically is clarity and truth. And so ambiguity and doubt, you have to, banish them. But there should be, even in an evangelical world, room for something called mystery.
Right.
Because, of course, the universe is full of that.
Right.
and
Right.
and that God has, gifted us with certain amounts of things that aren't necessarily clear to us. And that, in a sense, it's those mysteries that call us more deeply
Yes.
into a life of faith and a life of wonder and a life of awe. Because if everything was clear and everything was unambiguous and everything was just truth hanging uh, off of a tree, like fruit to be plucked, then, you know, what role is faith?
Right. But and I think
There is no role.
we've confused two words. We've confused belief with faith.
Yeah, we really
'Cause
have.
you have to know what you believe, quote unquote,
Right.
know for sure. Um, but faith is something very different.
Well, it's fascinating, of course, because the word believe, the root word of that is really to beloved.
Yeah.
It does not mean, when you say I believe, it does not mean, at least in its etymological sourcing, it did not mean to hold to a set of facts without variance. That's not what it meant.
Right.
It meant believe, meant to trust,
Yeah.
which is a disposition of the heart, and the German etymology of it is at least from belieben, which means beloved.
Mm.
And so it's to even say, belief isn't the point. Actually, the belief is the point, but the point is that we don't know what belief is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that we've mistaken it for opinion or fact or a scientific proof, when belief is really trust.
Yeah. And the whole idea of mystery, in my growing up years, it was never said to me this way, but this is what ultimately, looking back on it, our goal was to conquer mystery. That
Huh.
the end of faith, the end of our goal was to know that we know that we know that we know that we're going to heaven when we die, to know exactly who God is, what God is, to know exactly what the Bible is. And I think for a lot of people who've gone through this sort of this breaking down and unraveling and deconstruction, is the first thing that leaves you is that certainty.
Huh. Maybe
And
that's why I was a bad evangelical.
you should wear that like a badge of honor.
Well, it's the funniest thing. I was never a bad evangelical in what I did. I was the ultimate good girl. I mean, here I am, 59. You can see my face on the screen, even though people can't. There's barely a wrinkle there. I never smoked. I didn't drink. I have, like, I'm in really great health. It's because I kept all the rules. And so, people always tell me, "Oh, you look so young. What fresh looking skin you have, for somebody who's almost 60." And it's like, I just didn't have the need to, it was just not what I did. So I wasn't a bad evangelical in that way. But what I was a bad evangelical was I loved, I love uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because uncertainty is the thing that propels questions, and it propels the journey. If you know where you're going, why go there? It's kind of boring. That the journey itself is, it's even simple when you travel, is that you're not going to, if you start a journey in New York and say, I'm going to Paris and I'm going to go see the Eiffel Tower, and that's it,
Mm-hmm.
I know where I'm starting. I know where I'm ending. I know what I want to see. You put on these blinders and you miss everything else that's happening along the way. And what happens is a plane diverts, Yeah. Was the trip a failure? If you have to go to Spain instead, it's like,
right. Yeah.
And so for me, the lack of certainty is actually a really, truly powerful spiritual place to be. I think that my suspicion is that when I say lack of certainty, people say, oh, well, you have to have firm ground under your feet. A lack of certainty doesn't mean you're not grounded.
Yes. Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah, because my life is deeply